It's lovely to be with all of you. It's my pleasure to be doing this. Pope Francis, in chapter 4 of Laudato Si, speaks of the need for an integral ecology. And by that he means that if we want a secure future for our planet, it's not dependent on any one thing. Rather, we need to reclaim all that God's creative act means for us. We need to reclaim who we are in relationship to God, but we also need to think about our response to God in terms of economic, social, and political structures that will enable us to care for those most in need and those most adversely affected by the climate crisis and by the human efforts that have brought about that climate crisis. What I'd like to suggest is that when we come to talk about mission, when we talk about ministry, education, formation, any of the other issues that are part of the life of this plenary council, we need an integral view of the church, an integral ecclesiology to parallel Francis's integral ecology. That is, we need to take on board as many factors as possible to see how mission fits in to the wider experience of our relationship with God and who we are as a people of faith, as a church. So we can locate mission within God's mission. That's Vatican II's own words in terms of its document on mission, that the church is missionary because God is missionary. And God's missionary nature is God's self-giving that is creative. That God enters into history, Vatican II's document on Revelation says, to address human beings as friends and to invite us into communion with God. That's God's mission, to be life-giving. And that mission flows through the whole story of God's relationship with Israel, the multiple covenants that God initiates, all of which are about calling the people to a life beyond their own imagining. And of course, for us as Christian people, that mission has its highest expression in Jesus. And in the life of Jesus, in his words and in his actions that are dedicated to the proclamation and the embodiment of God's reign or God's kingdom, which is really one way to think about that, is that we're being invited into God's own life. And the more that we take up that invitation, the more we are equally invited to share that same life with others. And in the end, through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus and the sharing of the Holy Spirit, the church comes into being, in the words again of Vatican II, as both a sacrament of God, as a visible expression of God's action in history, and as a seed of God's kingdom. So the church is not God's kingdom, but we exist to serve God's kingdom. And we do that by our response to one another in human history. As a church, we have no option but to exist in our present. This is where we are. This moment of history is where God meets us and where our response to God is to meet the world. It's so important to keep in mind that the world of which we are a part is God's world. It's a graced world. It's a complex world in the way that each of us and our church are also complex realities. But nonetheless, it is grace. So in the words of the contemporary missiologist John Fullenbach, our task is to sniff out the presence of God in the world and to celebrate that presence where we find it. Our church can be a source of good news, to be a source of hope and healing where those things are present in the world that most distort the God who loves us, what Francis calls the peripheries. We are called to be, in the title of who we are as church in Vatican II, Lumen Gentium, a light to the nations. We will disagree on how we are best to do that, but our task, as it is for this whole week, is to listen to the Spirit, to listen to where the Spirit is calling us, to discern, and above all, to be open to be surprised by the activity of the Spirit already at work, to listen to those who can tell the church, tell us, both of our need for conversion and of our need to be more generous in response to God. So to listen to our Indigenous peoples, to listen to LGBTQ people, to people of other churches, of other faiths, to listen to our world where God's Spirit is always and already at work. Part of doing that is to be a self-critical church. Part of our mission, ironically, is to look at ourselves and to ask ourselves about whether our response is equivalent to what God is enabling. At present, I'm teaching a course on the theology of church, and one of the readings we used in class today was Karl Rahner's article on the function of the church as a critic of society. And most of that article is about the church being self-critical, to remind us that we don't address the world from a position of perfection, but from a position where we know we need to grow in response to God. And out of that, we have something to offer the world. We have the hope of the good news that we first have experienced, and that we can allow, encourage and enable other people to see where they too share that light of God's Spirit. The Synod on the Amazon a couple of years ago spoke of 3 tasks that face the church in terms of its mission. One is unlearning. We need to unlearn all of those things that make our God too small. We need to learn where the Spirit is at work, where God's vision for our world might differ from our own and challenge our own. All of us are capable, I think, of feeling that God on one of God's good days would agree with us and would even seek our advice. But the dynamic must go in the opposite direction. We must be open to be expanded by God. And then we need to relearn, unlearning, learning and relearning. And the relearning is relearning the wisdom of God at the heart of our tradition, that is not a limit to God, but is expansive, drawing us to the fullness of God's life, the eschatological reality of God. To conclude then, the American theologian Elizabeth Johnson, in one of her reflections on the Holy Spirit, says that the Spirit represents life, movement, colour, radiance, and restorative stillness in the din. Life, movement, colour, radiance, and restorative stillness in the din. The more that we are open to that Spirit, the more that is our work of this week, of listening, dialogue, discernment, and decision-making on top of it, the more as a church we can be a source of hope for the world. And ultimately, reflecting God's hope, God's life-giving to our world is our mission.